Hilchos Maaser Perek Chi, the laws of the Maaser separation, chapter 9. Today's chapter is going to be all about a subject which has come up for us a number of times throughout the Rambam, but today it's going to be treated in its original context, the Maaser separation, and that is the concept of demai. Demai is an Aramaic word that's a conglomerate of two words, which means damai. What is this? It's a reference to questionable produce which you don't know if for sure all the tithes were taken from it. And the reason that the question arose in the first place was because over time in Jewish history, as the Rambam is going to tell us, it became apparent that certain Jews were not as fluent in all the complicated laws related to separation from produce, and while they would keep some of the more severe ones, they wouldn't keep the more lenient ones, at least the ones in their eyes. Kind of like today, you find many Jews that will know what Yom Kippur is or Pesach is, like the high-level stuff in Judaism, and what they think is the low-level stuff, they're not familiar with it, they don't keep as much. This is how it used to be with agricultural mitzvahs as well. Every Jew was a farmer. And over time, certain Jews became more ignorant of, let's say, the less severe laws relating to tithing. And so because of that, a question began to arise when you bought produce from somebody in the market. You didn't know if they were familiar, if they were not familiar, if they were fluent or not, and whether or not their produce was tithed. And because of that, the sages made an overarching decree when it came to these unfamiliar Jews, that any grain that you buy from them is going to be called demai. Demai means we don't know what it is, and therefore, out of doubt, the Jew, the buyer, would have to tithe it again, to a certain degree, as the Rambam is going to define it all in today's chapter. So, says the Rambam, halacha aleph, let's see it inside. Bimei Yochanan kohen gadol. In the days of Yochanan the high priest, and the Rambam specifies which one because there were multiple Yochanan the high priest, as the Kesef Mishnah points out. Shahaya achar Shimon HaTzadik, the one that lived after the times of Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik, of course, in Pirkei Avos is the one mentioned as Mishirei Knesset HaGedolah. He was the last remaining of the men of the Great Assembly, who included Mordechai HaTzadik. They lived throughout the time of the Second Temple, and he, Shimon HaTzadik, was also a high priest, as recorded in the Gemara. And the Yochanan Kohen Gadol, the one that was after him, so this is later on in Second Temple times, Sholchu Beis Din HaGadol, the high court, the Jewish high court, sent some agents around to do a little survey about how the Jewish people were keeping the laws of agriculture. Ubadku b'chol gvul Yisrael, and they checked the entire border of the Jewish people. Umatzu, and they found shehakol zehirim b'truma gedola umafrishin oisa. What did they find? Truma, the great truma, the 2% that you give to the Kohen, everybody was careful with that. Even in the Torah it says it's very severe, punishable by death by the hands of heaven. So everybody treated it with high respect and was separating the truma. Aval Maaser Rishon, Maaser Sheni, Maaser Ani, but all the tithe is the first tithe, 10% for the Kohen. The second tithe, 10% that you take yourself to Jerusalem, as we're going to have in the next set of laws. Or the gift to the poor, which is also the second tenth in certain years of the Shemitah cycle. Hayu Amei Haaretz Mi Yisrael, the people of the land. In other words, the ignoramuses, the unfamiliar Jews, Mekilin Alatzman. They were being lenient on themselves. And they were not separating these tithes. Lefichach Gazru, therefore the high court came out with a decree and they said, only people that are established in their trustworthiness should be believed with regard to telling you the status of given produce if it's been tithed. Aval Amei Haaretz, but the regular folk, regular common people, Perei Sehen Safek. You always have to approach their produce with a doubt. They're not believed to say about their own produce that it's tithed. This is called, again, demai, a conglomerate of two words. Damai, what is this? We're not sure what it is. Vihiskinu, but the rabbis then said, even though they just created this massive doubt, putting all of the common folks' produce into question, when you buy such produce, they enacted the only thing you as the buyer absolutely have to separate and give away is the 10% of the 10% that would go to the Levi. In other words, you don't even know if the 10% was given to the Levi, but let's say it wasn't, then you have to take 10%. The Levi would have to take 10% and give it to the Kohen. That 10% of the 10% is what the buyer is responsible to give. Because Trumas Maaser is very strict, it carries with it a heavenly death penalty, and therefore you got to make sure to separate that. Maaser Sheni, And also the second tithe, she'ein bazeh hefsed, which would cause no loss to the buyer, sha'arei bai lavaychlan, I say, because the owner of the produce anyways gets to eat it. Aval Maaser rishon u'Maaser ani, but the first full tithe, the 90% that belongs to the Levi of the 10%, and the gift to the poor, the tithe to the poor, which if we would require you to give it, you'd be losing some of the produce which you bought. Ein mafresh min hadmai, the buyer doesn't have to separate from the questionable produce, because the whole thing is a doubt. We have a cardinal principle in Jewish law: when somebody wants to extract money or anything from a friend, the burden of proof is on the one who wants to extract it. So the Levi or the poor person is going to say, hey, give me my stuff. And you say, no, how do you know? Prove. This person, the buyer, will tell the Levi or the poor person, if you bring a proof that it actually wasn't tithe, then you can take your Maaser. But so long as you don't, I'm not going to be giving it to you. So, just to summarize, there was 3 tithes which Jews were not being careful with. The first tithe, the second tithe, and the poor tithe. The Rambam is saying that the sages put it all into question, but they didn't require you to give them all. The second tithe, fully, yes, you should give. It doesn't cost you anything. And of the first tithe, you only have to give 10%. That 10%, which would go to the Kohen usually. Halacha Gimel, afal pi she'ein mafrishin Maaser ani min admai, even though we don't actually separate the gift to the poor from the questionable produce, tzarich likres le'shem. You have to verbally designate it. Ve'einei mafrish. Not actually separate it, but you have to declare that it's somewhere in the produce. And you say verbally, Isur masha yesh kan Maaser ani. A tenth of what's here is the gift to the poor. Why do you have to say that? Kedei likboya Maaser sheni. To help in the other years when you give the second tithe, which goes to Jerusalem, if you want to firmly establish that, then you have to be giving a second tithe every year of the agricultural cycle. If in years 3 and 6, which is the time when you give the tithe to the poor, you're not even going to verbally designate it, and that might weaken the power of the second tithe that you separate in years 1, 2, 4, and 5, and not consider it a valid Maaser because you don't give any equivalent in the other 2 years. So during the years 3 and 6, when it's time to give the tithe to the poor, verbally declare that you're giving it, even if you don't actually separate it. In that way, in the other years, when you actually take the Maaser Sheni, it'll have a significance and a meaning legally. Shemaaser ani b'shlishis v'shishis, because the gift to the poor which you give on year 3 and 6 of the agricultural cycle, b'mkai Maaser Sheni shel shar shnei hashavua, comes in place of the Maaser Sheni that we give the other 7 years. And therefore, as I just explained, to give the Maaser Sheni significance, you also want to give Maaser Ani, at least verbally, during the 2 years that belongs to Maaser Ani. Halacha Dalid, Keshem Mafrishin Min Admai, Trumas Maaser U Maaser Sheni, when you make the required separation, the Trumas Maaser and the second tithe, as you can see over here, we just made it, this is 100 apples, so you're going to have to give 1 apple for Trumas Maaser, 10% of 10%, plus the other 9 apples for Maaser Sheni. So when you do that, Ein Mevarchin Alein, no need to make a blessing on them. Actually, you cannot make a blessing on them, because it's a doubt, and we have a rule that when you're in doubt about blessings, we don't make a blessing, perhaps it's going to be a blessing in vain. Therefore, for the same reason, you can separate these tithes even when you're naked. Typically, you can't do it when you're naked because you can't make a blessing when you're naked. But since there's no blessing over here, so you can separate it even without clothes. Halacha hey, ketzad ma'asrin es hadmai. How do you go about separating the demai? Now, what do you mean, how do you go about it? It's very simple. Take 1 apple for Trumas Maaser, 9 apples for Maaser Sheni. Doesn't work that way. You cannot take Trumas Maaser unless you first designate Maaser. You have to first designate 10% for the Levi, which from there you'll take the 10% and give it to the Kohen. But you're not planning to give the 10% to the Levi. That's the whole thing. The sages were lenient, and they said you can keep the Maaser. So the Rambam is going to show us that you have to verbally designate it, like the verbal designation of the gift to the poor, and then actually separate the Trumas Maaser. And it goes like this. Mafrish kedei Trumas Maaser, shu echad mimea min hakol. You begin by separating 1 apple, in this case, 1/100th from the entire mixture, which is going to end up being Trumas Maaser. Because again, if you have 100 apples, you take 10 for Maaser, 1 of them will be Trumas Maaser. So you start with that. You take the one that's going to eventually become Trumas Maaser, umanicha betzad peres, and you put it on the side of the pile of produce. V'omer, and you say, Ze Maaser, key word, not Trumas Maaser. Ze Maaser, ushar Maaser samuchle. I want to designate this as Maaser, along with the rest of the Maaser, because you got to designate 10 apples for the first Maaser, right, is going to be next to it. Now you're not specifying which apples they are, because anyways you're not planning to give it to the Levi, but the point is in your mind, you've put away 10 apples now as Maaser. And then you say, this specific apple, the blue apple, about which I said that it's part of the general unit of Maaser, I'm converting it now into Trumas Maaser. I'm designating it as the 10% of the 10%, which belongs to the Kohen, for the rest of the Maaser which is next to it, which I'm not planning to give to the Levi anyways. Take the blue apple, give it to the Kohen, that's the Trumas Maaser. And then you go on with doing whatever else you have to do. The reason you have to do this, says the Rambam, what I said before, you cannot separate the Trumas Maaser before you designate the Maaser as an initial preference. Therefore, by first declaring that it's part of the Maaser general unit and then saying it's Trumas Maaser, now you've done what's proper. And then you go and take the other 9 apples for the second tithe, which you're going to eat in Jerusalem in a state of holiness. With Demai, since the whole thing is a question, there's more leniencies. Here's another leniency. You can separate the second tithe before the first one. Usually you got to go in order. Here you don't have to go in order. V'im ratza, also if you want, right away, you can say, Oimer, Maaser Sheni shel Peres Elu b'tzvaynam oy b'draymam, v'harehu mechulal al hamois. The Maaser Sheni, the second tithe of this produce, is on the north or south side of the pile, and immediately I'm transferring the holiness to money. We'll see in the next set of laws that ideally, when you take the second tithe, you take all the food and you bring it to Jerusalem. What if you have massive amounts of crops? There's no way you can transport all the stuff to Yerushalayim without it getting rotten. So what you do is you transfer the holiness of that second tithe onto money, take the money to Jerusalem, and go and buy stuff there. Now, ideally, you have to separate the Maaser Sheni and then transfer it to the money. Here, because we're dealing with questionable produce, the Rambam says all you have to do is just say, the Maaser Sheni is somewhere in the pile, give it a direction, north side, south side, and right away transfer its holiness to the money. Same thing is if you buy a loaf of bread from a baker, and the baker is one of those people who's not trusted about tithing, so now you have to also take care of the loaf that you just bought in terms of Maaser. Additionally, you also have to take care of what's called challah. Challah we're going to have later on in this book. Whenever you make a dough, you must separate a piece from the beginning of the dough and give it to the Kohen. The same way the ignoramuses were not fluent in giving Maaser, they also weren't fluent in giving challah. And therefore, when you buy a loaf of bread from a baker, you have to assume that they did not take challah correctly, nor did they tithe it correctly, and you must make up for both things before you begin to eat the loaf. And the Rambam basically leads us through the same procedure, just this time including challah. What do you do? Mafresh mimena kedei trumas Maaser v'challah. You separate from the loaf 1/100th, which is Trumas Maaser, because again, if you would separate Maaser 10% of that would go to the Kohen, so it's basically 1% of the total, plus a little bit more for challah, for the beginning of the dough. V'omer, and then you say, while this piece is kind of separate, you say, Echad mimea mimasha yesh kan harehu Maaser, ushar Maaser samachlei. Same thing. This 100th that I've put on the side here is part of the Maaser, along with the rest of the Maaser that's next to it, which I'm not planning to give to the Levi. V'zesha asisi Maaser. Also, Trumas Maaser al Ashara Samachlei, the 1% which I actually designated as Maaser, becomes now Trumas Maaser for the rest of the Maaser which I haven't clearly designated. And the additional piece that's over the 1% which I separated, Harehu Chala, that's going to be Chala going to the Kohen. All that actually goes to the Kohen. And the second tithe is somewhere in the pile, north or south side, transferred immediately to money. Now you can eat the loaf of bread, having assured that all proper tithes were taken from it. That's like if somebody invites a friend to eat by him, and he doesn't believe him when it comes to Maaser. The commentaries say, so we're going to see in chapter 10 tomorrow, that if you are a person who is scrupulous about keeping the laws of tithes, you never end up as a guest in the home of somebody who's not careful about tithes. So here we must be talking about a case where you're not sure what the status of the host is. You don't believe him fully. There's a reason to suspect, but you don't know for sure that he's not keeping the laws. So you, as the fluent, fully observant Jew, is being invited to a person who's a little bit suspect, and you're invited for Shabbos, as the Rambam is saying here. Oimer me erev Shabbos, Friday you say to yourself, you make a verbal stipulation. Masha ani asid lahafrish lemachar harehu Maaser ushar Maaser samachlei. I'm going to leave a little bit of my cup. In this case, as the commentaries say, 1/100th. Again, the amount of Trumas Maaser. I'm going to leave a little bit of my cup. It's going to be Maaser, along with the rest of the 10% right next to it, which I'm not planning to give to the lady because it's only questionable. V'zesha sisi meiser, asui trumas meiser, al ashar asamuchloi. And the part of the cup which I leave over as specifically meiser will become trumas meiser, the 10% of the 10% for the rest of it next to it. Umeiser sheni b'tzvaynoi b'droimoi. And the second tithe is going to be somewhere in the north or south side of the cup and immediately transfer to the money. And then he can drink the cup, no problem. Even though the wine is not yet in your possession. It's only going to come tomorrow or tonight when you go to eat by the friend's house. But when it comes to demai, questionable produce, the rabbis were lenient, and they said you can make such stipulations. Were it to be definite produce, in other words, definitely untithed produce, then you couldn't make such conditions that what I'm going to do tomorrow is going to be Maaser, etc. You gotta own it. You got to have it in your possession in order to make such stipulations. Ketzad, what would be an example of making stipulations over produce which belongs to you? Let's say a person had 100 figs of tevel, untithed produce in his house, but he's learning in the study hall, which in those days, as the commentaries say, were outside of the city, so it was far away from your home. Or you're in the field outside the city. It's Friday afternoon, and you're a little bit afraid. Maybe I'll leave the study hall a little bit too late. Maybe I'll leave work too late. I'm not going to be able to get home in time to tithe the produce before Shabbos, and I won't be able to tithe it on Shabbos. But since the figs are in your possession, oimer, you can say in advance with stipulation, Shnei te'enim shani asid lehafrish harehin truma. I'm going to separate 2 figs, that'll be 2% truma. The eser shani mafresh achareya and meiser risha, and I'll separate another 10 after them for the first tithe for the Levi. The teisha shani mafresh achareya and meiser sheni, I'll take another 9 after that. Once you have 90 figs left, 10% is 9. The 9%, figs after that will be the second tithe. And the next day on Shabbos you can separate them and eat the figs as you normally would, because it isn't considered separating Maaser on Shabbos as you've already done it yesterday, and yesterday it was already in your possession, so you had the right to do that. In the last cases, you must move your lips when you say these stipulations. It's not just a mindful thing. You got to actually express it, even if it's inaudible, but your lips have to move. And then it will not be considered like somebody fixing stuff on Shabbos, which is not allowed. Because you've prefaced the Shabbos by your stipulation. If untithed produce has this stipulation made about it, it can also be moved on Shabbos before you separate it. Usually tevel is muktzah, you can't move it. But here, because there's a stipulation in advance that's going to allow it to be eaten on Shabbos, you can move it around. And simply with your eyes, look at a portion that you're going to designate later as the Maaser and eat the rest. Forget the invitation. A guy just comes over to you with a cup, says, Rabbi, please eat or drink this cup. Oimer, so you can't just turn it down. A little bit embarrassing. Obviously there's no kosher issues. We're talking about Maaser issues. You're worried he's not fluent about the laws of tithes, and here he's offering you a cup to drink. So immediately you make this condition pretty quickly. You say, Mashani asid l'shayer b'shulei hakois hariu Maaser. I'm going to leave a little bit on the bottom of the cup, 1/100th. That'll be Maaser, ushar Maaser samuchle, together with the rest of the 10% right next to it. V'zesha sisi Maaser, asur trumas Maaser, al hashara samuchle. The part that I designate clearly will be turned into trumas Maaser, 10% of a 10% that I'm going to leave. O Maaser sheni b'fi hakois v'hariu mechul ala mois, and let the second tithe be at the brim of the cup and immediately transfer to money. And now you can take the cup confidently, the shaisa, and you drink it, and of course you actually leave that amount, 1/100th, on the bottom of the cup as trumas Maaser and give it to the Kohen. Same thing if a friend invited you to drink this way on Shabbos. So he told you in advance. Make the condition before Shabbos for whatever you know you're going to be having at his home, and then it works. Same thing if you have a worker who doesn't believe the employer, and the employer, based on their contract, is supplying the worker with some food. So the worker who is more observant is worried that the employer didn't tithe the produce. You say, hold one dry fig in your hand, let's say it's figs, and you say, Zu v'teisha haboyes achareha asuyes Maaser al hameya shani asid lechel. I'm planning to eat 100 figs. This one and the 9 that are coming after it are going to be the Maaser for the 100. V'zuha achas, the one I'm actually holding, trumas ma'aser ala eser abayis achareha, is the trumas ma'aser, the 10% of the 10% for the first 10 figs that are going to come, that I've designated as ma'aser. U'ma'aser sheni hu ha'eser achreinais. The second tithe will be the next 10, really the next 9, because it's of 90, 10%. Will be the ma'aser sheni. V'areu mechul ala mois, and it's transferred to money. V'noisan ha'gregeres shehifrish lakayin. And then that fig that you put away as trumas ma'aser is gifted to the kohen. And the worker himself needs to bear the cost of the second tithe. Because the sages made a condition in the court. The employer should bear the cost of trumas ma'aser, that's the severe prohibition, and the worker should bear the cost of the ma'aser sheni, the lesser prohibition. Halacha yud beis hanachtoimim. Bakers. The sages never obligated them to separate the second tithe from their questionable produce. Ela trumas ma'aser bilvad. Only the trumas ma'aser, the 10% of 10%, 1% essentially. Kadesh yafrishana betara imachala. Trumas ma'aser, one should be separated in a state of purity. So while you take challah, take trumas ma'aser as well. But ma'aser sheni, it's unreasonable. Bakers get stuff wholesale. They get huge amounts of produce. If they're going to start taking ma'aser sheni, there's no way they can bring it to Jerusalem. And even if they transfer it to money, it's too much money. Too much produce to ask them to go to Jerusalem and use for their personal needs. So the sages never require that if it's questionable produce, they never have to take second tithe. Instead, the buyer, the end user who buys the loaf, should take his own ma'aser sheni. When do we say this leniency? If he's selling at a store or at the opening to a store. But if he's selling to a wholesale baker, in other words, he's the seller to the wholesaler, or near the store of a wholesaler, chayav lahafrish af ma'aser sheni, then you're obligated to separate even the second tithe. Halacha yud gimel shnayim shebatzru karmein b'teich gas achas. Let's use this slide again. Instead of a worker and an employer, it's two partners. Two partners are harvesting their vineyards, and they put it both into one big wine pit. And one of them is not believed, not trustworthy about ma'aser. Even if the guy who is fluent and trusted about ma'aser took all his tithes as he should, when he in the end takes his 50% of the wine, he has to take an additional ma'aser proportionally to how much of the other person's produce might be in the wine that he took home. In other words, you don't say what we call brera. We had brera the other day, retroactive clarification. Right? You might say, look, it's a 50-50 vineyard. He gets 50%, he gets 50%. This guy is trustworthy on ma'aser. He took all his tithes properly. So whatever wine he takes out of the vat should be considered as his retroactively. No. Every drop of wine is considered to be blended, partially owned by the fluent Jew, partially owned by the non-fluent Jew. And therefore, even if the fluent Jew did all his tithes properly, when he walks home with 50% of the wine, 50% of that may be untithed. So he needs to take ma'aser for the portion of the unfluent Jew that might have ended up in his produce. Ketzad, for example, hayu mechza lemechza, if it was even 50-50, v'neitel bechetzu masayim lug yayin, and he's walking home with 200 lug of wine, harezeh mafrish mimenu leg echad trumas ma'aser. So of the 50%, you have to assume 50% is untithed, so that's 100 lug. Of the 100 lug, every time we take ma'aser from questionable produce, you must take 1% as trumas ma'aser. So you take 1 lug for trumas ma'aser for the kohen, ve'eser ma'aser sheni, and 10 of them as a second tithe, keneged hamei aloik, opposite the 100 lug. That is the amount of questionable produce mixed into your produce. Because he already took his proper ma'aser for the definitely untithed produce, his half, when they pressed the grapes in the wine press. But the other half, you didn't take care of, and therefore, you got to take ma'aser now in the questionable way. And the commentaries discuss, why don't we indeed say the law of brera? It's only a rabbinic thing. The Rambam told us the other day that in biblical matters we don't say brera, but in rabbinic matters maybe we should say brera. So the commentators say, indeed, it's a penalty. It's a penalty. You should never have mixed your grapes with a Jew, the Jew's grapes, who you know wasn't keeping the mitzvahs as scrupulously, and because you did, you have to walk away with a little bit extra responsibility.